It was revealed overnight that the two other people who were in the car, who were jailed for 13 years in 2020, that's Jessie Cole and Albert Boas, might be released halfway through their sentences. So we know that the early release scheme has sort of been a point of contention for quite some time. The Conservatives had to put in a sort of brand of it just before they left office because of prison capacity. Labour continued it but added some sort of some conditions to that. But it's all set to change again in September, which is why there's the possibility, and there's now this deadline of September where these two people might be released halfway through.
Let's cut straight to the political chase. Andy Burnham says he will review the prisoner early release scheme. This comes after outrage at the news that two of the killers of PC Andrew Harper may be eligible to be released. The Prime Minister spoke to journalists a little earlier.
I feel for the family it's an appalling crime that was committed. The main perpetrator will not be subject to any early release. Of course, others involved have potentially been identified, but I've spoken to the new Justice Secretary. We will review the policy together and make further statements in due course.
Andy Burnham there. Well, Ollie Cole is newsroom reporter for The Times. Ollie, remind us what the case of PC Harper's killing involved.
So this was... Oh, hang on. I'm on this microphone over here. Give me a second.
Let's get the right one.
There we are.
There we go. Good.
So this goes back to a case that people might remember where PC Harper was killed after being dragged along by his ankles in a tow rope behind a car. Now, the driver of that, as Andy Burnham said there, isn't up for early release, but it was revealed overnight that the two other people who were in the car, who were jailed for 13 years in 2020, that's Jessie Cole and Albert Boas, might be released halfway through their sentences. So we know that the early release scheme has sort of been a point of contention for quite some time. The Conservatives had to put in a sort of brand of it just before they left office because of prison capacity. Labour continued it but added some sort of some conditions to that. But it's all set to change again in September, which is why there's the possibility, and there's now this deadline of September where these two people might be released halfway through.
As you say, the early release scheme has been very, very contentious. Everybody can understand why it is incredibly distressing for the families of victims if they know that prisoners are part of this early release scheme. But obviously the reason for doing it is because of reaching capacity across our jails. So at the same time, we have to ask of this new Prime Minister, how does that part of the problem get solved? Yeah,
exactly. And in the short term, there might be a little sort of political and prison capacity window that Andy Burnham can act within. So at the moment, there's around 3,000 spare prison places on the prison estate, and that's after years of the estate running really hot, being up at sort of 98-99% capacity pretty much month on month. So there is a slight potential political window here for Andy Burnham to look at that again, which is what he's promised to do today. The difficulty is that this change in the scheme from September means that people on standard determinant sentences could come out earlier, so after 40 or 50% of their term. Prisoners due for release at the 67% point will be let out at 50. They might, if they behave badly, they might get denied release. But the problem is it's not discriminate. So once you hit September, there actually isn't that mechanism that we've seen before to say, people on manslaughter offences or serious violence offences or sexual offences now are sort of outside of the frame of that possibility happening. So that's where that sort of slight window of opportunity politically and through legislation could be managed, and that's where Andy Burnham and Alex Norris, who's just started now as Justice Secretary and immediately has this on his plate, will be trying to work out, what happens if we take this group of people out, what happens if we take that category of people out, and does that still balance with making sure that we've got enough capacity in our prisons before we can get more up and running, which, as we know, is a much longer term headache.
Yeah. OK, let's talk about some of the other stuff around today. Andy Burnham was meant to be spending the day talking about caps on bus fares. It is only day 2. We've got another cost of living measure as he's promised. Tell us a bit more about this one.
Yeah, so this is sort of Andy Burnham's attempt quite early on in his premiership, and I think this is interesting from a sort of how political this Labour Prime Minister is compared to Keir Starmer in the last 2 years. Because if you think of the big standout moments early on in Keir Starmer's premiership, the first one that we all remember was that winter fuel moment, so that, you know, everything is going to be much worse for a lot longer than we thought, and things will be good again, but not for some time. And that really set the government off on quite a sort of downward negative foot. What you can see here is Andy Burnham is trying to play the political campaign a little bit more quickly, especially early into his premiership and into the summer. So yesterday we had the VAT coming off electricity bills from October. From next year and throughout next year, you've now got this £2 bus fare cap, and this is on individual journeys, so it won't apply in London where there's already a sort of cap on certain days and amounts of journeys you can take. But this is a flat £2 cap. It's something that Andy Burnham introduced in Greater Manchester when he was mayor. It's something the Tories then brought in under Boris Johnson. Rishi Sunak sustained it. Keir Starmer put it back up to £3, and Andy Burnham's now turning it back again. But you can see these are the sort of things that, as far as the Burnham government is saying, look, a lot of the problems that the country faces are quite long-term, and that is going to be the big challenge for this government now, is how do you actually balance the books in the third and fourth year of your administration against all this rush of good news that you're playing at the moment. But what he's trying to do at the moment is say, look, let's give you a bit of breathing space, let's get some of this out ahead of the summer. It is difficult, the funding for this £2 bus cap, though, because it's essentially the way they're funding it, as far as most of us can make head or tail of it. They're essentially moving something from one bit of a spreadsheet into another bit and almost spending the money twice. So that question of how
Hang on a
much
sec.
it's...
Go again on that.
So essentially, it comes out of... I've had to spend a long time this morning working this out, but there is we currently give grants to other countries to help them tackle climate change and the climate crisis through our climate agreements. So that money is given as a grant, which means that when it comes to the Treasury and the books, that money is spent, it's gone, and it's never coming back again. What they're going to do is they're going to change that grant into a loan, so that money technically is coming back to them. But obviously, we don't know over what amount of time, we don't know on what terms, we don't know what interest is going to be on it, and we're not aware of, you know, how long a gap we've got to fill. But it means that technically that money isn't down as already spent because it's loaned and you can spend it again. So it's a bit of Treasury trickery going on here.
Okay, so we're basically spending a Christmas bonus fund in the summer before we know that the Christmas bonus fund is full.
Yes, if you like. There we go. Okay.
Do you know what? I'd also be very interested to hear from our listeners about bus fares themselves, because as you said, we're operating in London. It's quite complicated, actually, the bus journey thing in London. Quite often you have to take 3 different buses to complete your journey, which means that I'm afraid I'm quite ignorant about how much people are paying for bus fares. I would very much like to hear what this actually means to you, and certainly if you're using buses to commute, then a £2 cap could mean an awful lot, because the criticism yesterday, Ollie, was 45 quid is 45 quid. It actually works out at, you know, somewhere between £1 and £2 a week for families with the VAT on electricity. So it's a great start, but actually not huge. 0333 003 2353 is our number this afternoon. All of this, Ollie, if we just pull the lens back a little bit, is underlining how hard it is to control the narrative as Prime Minister. Andy Burnham's had to do a little bit of naughty step action already, hasn't he? And of course it's complicated. I mean, in a way it should be complicated. You shouldn't be able to just deliver a message, it lands all great.
No, exactly. And I think that, you know, there is going to be a difficult process here where Andy Burnham has essentially been, you know, campaigning in campaign mode as both a mayor outside of Westminster and then campaigning to become Prime Minister for quite some time. And you know, a couple of Number 10 insiders have already told me, people who've been throughout a few administrations, that it's already becoming quite clear that Andy Burnham is having to get used to the reality of government, and that is a totally different reality that you have to operate in. Like you say, he's had to sort of slap down a little bit. Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, and Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, today over some comments they made in the back of Number 10 Downing Street. They all went out and had a sort of cup of coffee after a cabinet meeting yesterday and stood out there. Some of that audio leaked. They made a joke about releasing prisoners. What's interesting about it is there's a sort of like... I'm really torn on this as to how much does it stop us electing people who are just normal people if we come down on things like this, which is actually the reference, and this is, I picked this up immediately because I'm a political nerd, but if you think everyone around the cabinet is also a political nerd, then you can sort of understand where this comes from. Ken Clarke and Theresa May, there always used to be this joke that Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, and Ken Clarke was Justice Secretary, Theresa May, way back to 2011, 2012, used to say, well, you know, the thing is with Ken is I lock him up and he lets him out. And that is the sort of relationship between Home Secretary and Justice Secretary. So the pair are referencing that joke. The problem is the context, as we start this conversation, is you've currently got an early release scheme that is perhaps getting even more broad and too broad for public tastes coming down the track in September. You're not talking about it, and you've just been reappointed to cabinet and you've made a joke in that area. That's where it leaves perhaps a bit of taste in the mouth. But it is difficult because if you are a Westminster type, you end up referencing things that a lot of other people don't really understand.
Yeah, and there is a dark kind of humour involved in politics, involved in many places, actually, many workplaces. But I absolutely hear you, because then when it comes out into the open, it has normal oxygen around it. It can feel really, really offensive. Ollie, thank you very much indeed. That's Ollie Cole. Let's turn our attention now to the north. One surprise addition to Andy Burnham's government is the Scottish Labour leader, Anas Sarwar, who's expected to resign his position to become a minister in Westminster. Let's talk to Daniel Sanderson, who is the Times' Scottish political editor. Daniel, thank you for your patience. Tell us a little bit more about what you know about this and why Anas Sarwar would be important to Andy Burnham's government.
Well, I think he's seen as a talented politician. You know, he's despite the poor election result a few weeks ago, he's seen as someone who can, you know, perhaps sell Britain on a global stage, which perhaps explains why he's being made a business minister. But yeah, our information is, you know, this has all come together relatively recently. Very few people knew about it. Like, we got wind of this sort of yesterday afternoon. We were asking people if it was true. They were denying it, but it turns out they just didn't know about it. So yeah, a real shock, and it's be very controversial, to say the least, in Scottish Labour.
So Sarwar was the first big Labour name to call for Keir Starmer to go, and on the day he did that, there were quite a few mutterings about whether or not Wes Streeting might have had a little chat with him. Other people who wanted to throw their hat into the ring might have had a little chat with him. That seemed to be the direction of travel, but of course we've changed now, haven't we? Do you think it's more likely that he had a chat with Andy way back then, or is Andy only chatting to him relatively recently?
Yeah, well, it's interesting thinking back to that. I mean, on that, I think it was a Monday when he had called for Keir Starmer to quit. And he was pretty open. He said he'd spent the weekend, you know, taking soundings from people across the Labour Party. We don't know for sure he spoke to Andy Burnham. We know he did speak to Wes Streeting, but we're trying to find out. But I don't think it would be a surprise at all if he did. I mean, you know, we know they're fairly close. They've got a decent working relationship. You know, Anas as leader of Scottish Labour, and Andy at the time as mayor of Greater Manchester. There was an obvious sort of overlap there. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all if they had spoken. But I think the idea that, you know, this was all sort of some sort of plot going back to then is probably a conspiracy too far. When you think back to, you know, back then in February, Andy Burnham wasn't really seen as, you know, one of the front runners.
No, I mean, I'd defy anyone to have had a very clear master plan of British politics over the last 5 years or so. Anyway, Daniel, how big a problem does this leave for his Labour colleagues?
Well, I think it's going to be, it's seen as potentially a pretty big problem in Scotland. You know, it means that there's going to be a leadership contest, and if there's one thing Scottish Labour know how to do, it's how to have a divisive leadership contest. There's all sorts of ideas that are already floating around, you know, breaking ties with the UK party, perhaps having some sort of new offer on the constitution, which would potentially be very divisive. You know, the factionalism between left and right of the party up here. So there's that, which is causing a lot of concern, and it's just real anger, I think, at the timing of this, if not the fact that Anas is stepping down. I mean, he spent weeks telling everyone that there was no prospect of this, that he was staying for the full term, and there's a feeling perhaps that he's feeling upwards a bit, having just led Scottish Labour to their worst ever performance at a Scottish Parliament election.
So if you were a betting man, Daniel, on whom would you be placing a little flutter?
I think the front runner is a guy called Michael Mara, who is the current finance spokesman. He's more of a centrist. He's a very bright, very ambitious, but there is likely to be a challenge from, interestingly, because Anas is leaving, the next person on the regional list gets in, and that's Monica Lennon, who is more on the left of the party and has stood for the leadership before. Anas actually beat her fairly narrowly in 2021, so she'll have a lot of support. Paul Sweeney, who's a Glasgow MSP, he's seen as one of the few in the Hollywood group who's particularly close to Andy Burnham. So if Burnham threw his weight behind him, that could be significant. So it's pretty open at the minute. I think Michael Mara's the early front runner, but all to play for.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Daniel Sanderson, who is The Times' Scottish political editor.